I was doing mock auditions and listening to my recordings and thinking, oh man, I sound better than I ever have. Like, okay, this worked. Every single one of those reps during that period has a metronome and a drone on. Once people learn to practice slow, they call their old teacher and they're like, hey, I started practicing slow. I would look back on the process and I would say, oh, I could have worked harder. You know, there was that one day I took off, or those couple days that I took off, or that day that I only practiced an hour, or that day that I hung it up at 5 p.m. when I really could have stayed till 7 or 8 p.m.
What we connected about on the last time we chatted for the podcast was this process you'd come up with for just managing as you progress toward the audition date, and just how you balance your workload and approach each excerpt. And I remember David Allen Moore telling me years ago, you should ask people, how did they win a job while holding down another job? And I never really understood that until I started to really understand what it takes to play in a full-time professional orchestra. Can you maybe just lay out, if people are not familiar with the 7-service, 8-service week, like what does a typical week look like in the St. Louis Symphony or whatever job you want to frame it?
Yeah, well, pretty much every full-time orchestra will have one rehearsal on Tuesday, and then 2 rehearsals on Wednesday, and then Thursday will be a rehearsal in the morning and a concert at night, and then Friday another concert, Saturday another concert, or maybe there'll even be a second program, like another rehearsal on Saturday with a pop show on Sunday night or Saturday night or something. So you're working between they call them services, a rehearsal or a concert is a service, and you're either working, 6 services or up to 9 services in a week. I've even had, like last year, I was doing our opera season in St. Louis, and they did what they call a hire back, where they brought me onto the other split to play the 2 other operas I wasn't playing, like as a sub, and I ended up having a 11 service week. Which is not common and usually doesn't happen. But anyway, you're working, 20 to 25 hours a week, like playing the bass for someone else, not for you. And so then if you're trying to prepare an audition on top of that, that's an additional however many hours you're going to be practicing.
I think people who are experienced with maybe more traditional jobs, they might say 20-hour work week, sweet, I have all the time in the world. But what it takes to be on your game for those 20 or 25 hours, I find myself mentally wiped, physically wiped, and I've been so impressed, especially these last few seasons when they've needed some more subs here in the San Francisco Symphony, sitting next to people that are taking auditions while doing that. And after a double rehearsal or having a morning rehearsal, knowing I have an evening concert, the thought of going and practicing the bass, I find incredibly distasteful. I want to go do something else.
I also find it distasteful, but sometimes that's just what you have to do.
Yeah, exactly. And before we dive into all the details, do you still try to take Mondays off whenever possible from the bass?
Well,
okay.
when I'm in audition prep mode, absolutely. When I'm not preparing an audition, I'm doing the job and I'm practicing for that job. The expectation is that you're always performance ready by the first rehearsal so that you don't waste any rehearsal time, learning your part in front of everybody else. So, I'm probably playing 35 hours a week maybe, and with that low of a workload, I mean, it's not that low of a workload, but with that low of a workload comparatively to my max, I don't need a day completely off. I sometimes end up accidentally taking Monday off just because, or Sunday if I only have a Saturday concert. But yeah, the Monday off every single week, I got that from Alex Hanna, and that I adhere to that really, really strictly when I'm trying to prepare an audition while also doing the job.
I just think it's so interesting how people approach that, because anything like this, sort of like the sort of endless game that is bettering yourself as a musician. I mean, it could always be better. You could always work a little bit more. You could always be thinking about it. I remember, I think it was from Ryan's podcast or maybe from mine too, when you were in audition prep mode and taking that Monday off, you were like not thinking about classical music performance.
That's the goal.
Right? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you get like earworms from the music you're playing that week, or maybe there's something on the audition list that's really catchy and it's in your head. But yeah, that Monday, I'm not doing any score study or research or The only recordings I might listen to are just for pleasure, like usually stuff outside of what I'm preparing for the audition, maybe some like great Baroque music or something. But yeah, that day is no music or no work music. And it usually ends up being a little longer than 24 hours. If I can get my Sunday practice done early, that's awesome. Like if I get up early on Sunday and get all my stuff done, by the mid-afternoon, then I'm not playing the bass from like 2 p.m. Sunday until 10 a.m. Tuesday. And so it's like almost like a 2-day break, which is great for just my body and mind and helps me feel refreshed and comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember chatting with Alex. Alex Hanna. He was the person where I relaunched the podcast with. And I remember chatting with him about how he approached just not burning out as he is prepping for Chicago Symphony, certainly, probably his previous auditions. But yeah, getting that break. Or I remember him even saying if he was feeling a little burned out, he would just like take a half day, like do some practicing and then just sort of like do something fun.
Yeah, I remember him telling us that when we were in Civic and hearing it on your podcast as well. I listened to a ton of your podcast episodes when I was taking auditions before getting a job. And yeah, I remember him saying 1 day off per week, 1 half day per week if you need it, and you probably will need it. And yeah, it just kind of gives you enough space to not get burned out, not get injured. I mean, that's kind of the more important thing in my mind. I mean, I know burnout is definitely a very real thing, but people will ask me oftentimes, like, how do you prepare an audition with a job? And, I find myself really stretched thin between, working and then also trying to practice enough and have time for my friends and family and my dog and this. And there's, being pulled in so many different directions. And my answer is, like, it's not fun, but my answer is just like, well, you're just not going to have that much fun for 6 weeks or 2 months or however long your audition prep is. Like, you're going to have to sacrifice your quality of life a little bit if this is something you really want. My old teacher, Andy Ricidi, would always say, you have to be a monk. You got to be a monk for like a month or two. Just work, sleep, fuel. That's basically it. And Monday I'll have fun, or like Sunday night I'll have a lot of fun with my buddies, and then Monday is my recovery day. But I think just working really hard, like, it's not enjoyable always. But if you're trying to work a full-time job and prepare an audition, there's really no shortcut to just like being a little bit miserable for a little while, in bursts, of course.
If I recall correctly, you were finding some success out of the gate. I think you advanced at maybe your first or one of your first professional auditions, but I'm sure your process has also refined over the auditions. Like, how did you approach? This is a giant question, so sorry, but like, how did you approach maybe those first initial auditions, and then how did it refine down to these last few?
Well, so my first audition was for the Kansas City Symphony in I believe it was 2015. I didn't prepare very well. I got lucky and I advanced, but I was just in shape from going to school. I was at Northwestern having orchestra rep class every 2 weeks, playing in studio class every 2 weeks, taking lessons with Andy every 2 weeks, hearing my colleagues all the time, playing in orchestra. I was also playing in the Kalamazoo Symphony at the time, so basically one subscription style concert per month, maybe one pop show every other month or so. So I was just in shape. I was playing a lot. I was studying the repertoire with a good teacher and, a lot of inspiring colleagues, students around me. And so I didn't really have a system. I just kind of threw myself at it and just practiced, and it went okay. And then I made finals in Detroit later that year, and it was a similar thing. I just was building on that previous success. The list came out and I saw the excerpts and I thought, well, I kind of know all these. Oh, this Bartók excerpt is I've never heard of that before. I better take a little extra time to look at that one. I brought that into like the first lesson after I got the list. But other than that, I mean, I didn't really have a system at first. I just kind of practiced, play through things and fix the issues that I heard, or try to unsuccessfully try to fix the issues that I heard. And then I kept kind of doing a similar thing, and I sort of started adding and subtracting various things based on what I heard from other people who had success. So again, your podcast, like, hugely helpful. I got a lot from listening to Ian Hallis's episode and Robin Kesselman's episode and Alex and Andy and Caleb and all these people who were winning jobs right before me or way before me, great pedagogues. I took a lot of information from them. So a lot of the stuff that I use in my process, it's not like original thought. It's just co-opting, the best of someone else. So I mean, at first, one of the things I added was drone work. I got that from Ian Hallis. He wouldn't do drone work. He would go through the entire list at 60 beats per minute, quarter note per note. Like just play every note as a quarter note and just for intonation. And I tried doing that for 3 or 4 auditions. It gave me a little more solidity. And then I started doing a little more metronome work, and then I started adding drones, and then I kind of found this like half tempo thing that I think Ryan Beach figured out from powerlift. He sort of adapted powerlifting techniques or like endurance training. If you talk to marathon runners, they do a very similar percentage-based build-up process in their training. And so I started, incorporating that, and I gave it a shot. The first audition I tried it for was the Chicago Symphony audition that was canceled due to their strike in 2019. And I didn't get to take the audition because it was canceled, but I was doing mock auditions and listening to my recordings and thinking, oh man, I sound better than I ever have. Like, okay, this works. And so I tried it again for St. Louis a couple weeks later, and I won the audition. And then I did it again for the Minnesota audition, which was about a month after that, and I won a trial on that as well. And so since then, I have used the exact same process every time. I vary it based on how early I start. If I have 2 months to prepare or 3 months to prepare, I'll do more reps at low tempos. I might stay at 50% tempo for a week or more before moving up at all. And then when I move up, I can move up in smaller increments, 3%, 2% maybe, and I'll just get more reps, more time kind of pressure cooking the excerpts. And then if I have less time, I mean, I've prepared auditions in as little as 10 days. I'll just do fewer increments and fewer reps. Maybe I'll aim for 4 reps at half tempo or 3 reps at half tempo instead of 6 or 5. And then instead of jumping in 5% increments, I'll jump in 10% increments or more. Maybe at the end of the process, I'll do both 70 and 80% tempo in one day instead of spread out over 2 days. And then with those shorter periods, I also decrease the number of mock auditions I do. So it's all proportional. If I'm working, let's say for 2 months before an audition, I'm going to do 6 weeks, maybe 6.5 weeks of percentage-based build-up. And every single one of those reps during that period has a metronome and a drone on. Absolutely. And then a week and a half of mock auditions and refining and tweaking things that I hear in performance, and then the last 2 days I do very little. I basically play things slow and quiet, like one time. The day before the audition, I want to play no more than an hour. It's not always possible. I've had auditions on a Monday when I was performing a concert on Sunday. So I ended up playing, the concert plus 45 minutes of my own stuff. But anyway, so that's about a 2-month process. With like a 10-day process, I would do 7 days of build-up, 2 days of mocks, and then 1 day of chilling. And then you can kind of, see where that goes. If it's a 4-month process or a 1-month process, a similar kind of ratio of time there.
Cool. It's cool to have a process that can scale like that. And I've got a lot of follow-up questions, but
yeah, sure.
Why do you think? What is half tempo? Why does that seem to work? Why did that work for you? Why does that seem to work for people? What is it about? Like, what does that sort of like open up in the process, or how does that? Because that seems to be a takeaway that I've gotten from a lot of people. Is it's like dial it down to half tempo and chill out there, maybe for longer than you think you should.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of ways that can help. I know it's a big question. I think first of all, everything is it's so much slower than you're ever going to play it that you can take a lot of the stress out of the equation. Mm-hmm. I'm sure everyone's felt like they're playing something and you feel a little nervous that, oh, this is hard or this is difficult or, oh, I really need to work on this because it's so hard. playing most things at half tempo is not that hard. There are still some moves that are tricky. You know, maybe you have to make some enormous leap from the bottom of the bass to the very top, or a triple string crossing in an awkward position or an awkward key or something. And that stuff is obviously going to be basically twice as hard when you're playing it at tempo versus half tempo. So first of all, it just makes everything easier. Gives you a little more physical space to relax and feel calm and build confidence. Another thing is that it gives you time to really listen to every note and focus on every note, instead of playing, when you're playing something really fast, sometimes you can kind of just hear the big gesture. I know when I hear sometimes like violins or flutes or something doing something really crazy and fast, I can't even, like, my brain just can't go fast enough to even hear all the notes. It just sounds like, what? I'm like, did they play 20 notes in that span? Like, okay, my brain just kind of says, nope, overload, stop it. So going slower gives you time to really focus and be very deliberate about every note. What type of, what quality of articulation are you looking for? What is the shape of the note? Is there a decay? What type of decay? If you're going to draw the shape of the note on a chalkboard or whatever, draw the note on a piece of paper, what does that note look like? Is it shaped like a torpedo? Is it shaped like a windsock? Is it shaped like a trombone bell? Is it something more complex with a bulge in the middle and a taper at the end? Or whatever it is, you have time to really input those signals into your bow arm. And I mean, left hand as well. Like, how do you want to shape the phrase with your vibrato, like a singer? It's not just going to be the exact same constant speed over the course of a phrase. You can pace the width of the oscillation and the speed of the oscillation. How do you use that to enhance the phrase that you're trying to make? When you're playing at half tempo or even slower, that you just have time to hear all that stuff. I remember when I first kind of figured this stuff out, which again, I didn't figure anything out myself. I just, it's like once people learn to practice slow, they call their old teacher and they're like, hey, I started practicing slow. And they're like, what do you think I've been telling you to do for the last 10 years, But I remember telling my wife, she's a violinist, about this, and she tried, some crazy fast excerpt that they have. And she's like, 50 isn't slow enough. I'm like, so go slower, go 40% or 35% tempo. Just go as slow as you need to make it really, really comfortable. And also, the other thing about half tempo, it's not for every excerpt, but for a lot of them, 50% is actually kind of uncomfortable. It forces you to live with the sound of that excerpt for longer than is physically natural. When I used to practice under tempo before working the way that I do now, I would just go down to a tempo that felt comfortable. Everything felt secure. Everything felt like I could comfortably play it. And that seemed good. But if you just dip a little below that into another point, a new point of discomfort in a different way, you'll kind of unlock something different about how slow you can move, what type of connection you have to the string. And ultimately, those are the things for me that I find hold up under pressure. If I play a bunch of things at tempo, I don't really get much better. I even, with a really difficult piece in the orchestra, if you see me warming up on stage before like a fast lick that I'm maybe struggling to get at tempo, the last thing I'll do before we perform it is I'll just play it a little bit under tempo, a little bit or maybe way under tempo, and a little bit under volume with perfect coordination. Something my old teacher used to say, Andy Rusidi, again, he would always say, muscles remember feeling, not speed. So if you just train them to be comfortable and slow and super coordinated, that's what they'll know how to do. They won't know how to panic and freak out and tighten up like I'm sure, so many of us have done trying to play fast.
Well, I remember Andy expressing that very sentiment to me with my microphones in his office like 8-9 years ago. And I've thought about that so much since chatting with him about that. I've got a very nerdy, this is all nerdy, but it's okay, but a very bass specific question. Like, how do you deal with like off the string strokes when you're going half tempo? Are you, I'll just leave it at that. How do you, because I mean, there are many approaches one could take.
Yeah. I think you can do it a couple of different ways. The way that I do it is I actually kind of try to do things more on the string when I'm playing slow. It goes back to that drawing the shape of the note. So if you draw the waveform of a note in a bounce stroke at tempo, what's the shape of the note? It's probably like a big attack and then an immediate decay and then a little bit of space before the next note, right? So I basically just want to take that exact same shape and stretch it to be twice as long. The same envelope, the same amount of, the same velocity of decay, and just make that sound, but twice as long. So, for something like, I don't know, Beethoven 5, with that one, I would basically play it with my bow hanging in the string, and I'm just aiming for really clear, crisp attack with almost immediate decay and release. So it's not extremely short, but there's definitely a change in the dynamic pretty quickly, and then a little bit of space before the next note, and that would basically be on the string for me at half tempo. And something that I figured out after doing this a few times, the way that I've found to translate this stuff from half tempo to full tempo is to play it in the point in the bow where you are eventually going to play it. So playing something like Beethoven 5, bum ba 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 ba, half tempo, the comfortable place to play that at that tempo is like basically right on the frog, right? And eventually you're not going to play it right on the frog. It's going to go too fast for that. You're going to be probably near the balance point. And so if you do that half tempo stuff at the balance point, it feels a little weird doing it that slow out there in a spot that's kind of not natural for that tempo, but that is what I found works its way up to tempo successfully. And then the other thing you can do, and I've done this a couple times with some particularly strokey excerpts like, I don't know, Falstaff, is you can double or triple the stroke. So you play the actual bounce stroke that you're eventually going to play, but just with a half tempo left hand. And I don't do a lot of that. I'll maybe do, if I'm doing 5 reps at half tempo, 1 rep will be like that, just to kind of say, okay, this is the stroke I'm going to be playing in a month. So remember how it goes. And then the other thing that I've seen people do, and again, I don't do a lot of this, I might do 1 rep out of 5 like this, is like a true off the string, a little bit higher bounce than you're eventually going to use, but just aim for a really comfortable, free, ringing spiccato. And that is, again, that's not something I do very often. Part of it's because my tendency, the way that I tighten my bow and the way that my, technique works, bouncing is easy. It's like my bow wants to bounce too much. It wants to just like lift off the string forever. And so a lot of this process is about kind of maintaining a connection to the string for me and staying more in the sound with like a wind or a brass player, like they're not thinking about strokes and bouncing, jumping things. They're just moving air, and there's just the center, the core of the note. And I just want to find that center and core of the note on every note and keep it going.
I love that number 5. That also seems to, in terms of repetitions, that 5 repetitions seems to click with a lot of people. And obviously it can vary depending on the excerpt and the amount of time you have. I've tried to apply that to things I'm working on too. And there's something about, not just once, not just twice, but kind of living with it. How clearly are you setting, if you are, although I imagine you are you setting like your intention for what you're trying to do with those 5 reps? Like, for example, are you taking 1 rep and just feeling the sensation in the left hand, or 1 rep and just really focusing on intonation, or your how does that process work for you?
I'll maybe kind of let my focus shift around to a couple different things throughout the 5 reps, but the goal on every single one is to just sound the way that I want to sound. I'm aiming for the eventual sound that I'm aiming for. That sounds kind of stupid, but I'll definitely maybe in 1 rep kind of think a little more about the right hand or a little more about the left hand. But that's part of that sort of magic of starting at such a low tempo and doing it so many times at a low tempo, is you can really ingrain, like you have time to feel all of it. You have time to listen to all of it. And then you're also giving yourself enough time to ingrain all that stuff so deeply that when you move to 55% tempo or 60 or whatever, it doesn't feel like there's less time to do that. You still feel like you have control over every single note. This is like so reductive, but something I always tell my students kind of as a half joke, but it is real, is if you just focus on the beginning, middle, and end of every note, you'll be good. Like that's it, really. And half tempo oftentimes gives you enough space to listen to the beginning, middle, and end of every note you play.
And it's just making me reflect on how easily we musicians overcomplicate things, and how that really is. I mean, when you boil it down, that's actually a really good takeaway. And something I think I'd just like to highlight is you have taken many auditions and been very successful on the audition path and won positions and trials and all sorts of stuff. Yet, what you're saying, you are still bringing that down to half tempo, and I think it's so easy, certainly for me, probably for others, to just be like, no, I've reached this other plateau, and I don't do that anymore. I'm good. Maybe dust it off, polish a little bit, but just the fact that you have found this process to be valuable and that you're repeating this process even with the success you have. I think it's just like, I just want to highlight that that there's definitely power in this way of working that you found.
It's just the only way that I've found that I can really guarantee my own personal success. You can never guarantee the success of any audition, the result, from the other side of the screen, but you can pretty much guarantee that you're going to play at the level that you can play, and up to that level, and up to that level of preparation. How prepared you are. You basically just want to sound as prepared as you are, right? And this method was like the only way that I can guarantee that I will do that. I've tried other ways, just kind of, pulling it out and like, I've played this excerpt for 20 years and I know how I've played it in the orchestra 10 times. There's no problem. I'll play it. But it's like, I don't have control over every single note then. I can get pretty close. I still sound like me. Like when I just whip out an excerpt that I haven't played in a few months or even a few years and I still just have it kind of memorized, it's not like it sounds bad, but the standards at auditions are so high. Auditions are so competitive that the only way to give myself an edge over, not even over other people, but just over myself, is to just make, you have to present the best version of yourself. And this process is the only way that I can guarantee that I'll do that for me.
So you got an audition coming up, and maybe you got 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, whatever you have. You're going to live like a monk. But then the actual nitty gritty, and here you are holding down either position in Seattle Symphony, St. Louis Symphony. You got that 7-8 service week, maybe even more, depending on the week. And I remember listening to you talking with Ryan Beach about how you do this. But like, how do you actually weave that practicing into your life, practically speaking?
You start early and end late. When I'm really in the thick of prep and I have a heavy week in the orchestra, I'm getting up at or before 7 a.m., putting in maybe an hour and a half, hopefully 2 hours before our 10 a.m. rehearsal. When I'm at rehearsal, I use the break. Like I don't warm up or practice during break. I use the break as a break. So 20 minutes of not touching the instrument. And then, lunchtime, same thing. I'm not playing during lunch other than maybe a couple minutes of warm up to, just get my rosin on and stuff before the afternoon rehearsal. And then after the afternoon rehearsal, go home, take a nap, like immediately. The 20-minute or the 45-minute power nap are like really good. 90 minutes is good, but I usually don't have time for that. And then I'll do like an evening session from 5 until 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. Sometimes, I've been up practicing at 2 a.m. sometimes. And all of that is built on the backbone of lots of breaks, lots and lots of breaks. I'm never just, when I say playing 2 hours, first thing in the morning, that's not 2 hours straight. That's maybe 40 minutes on, 10 minutes off, 30 minutes on, 5 minutes off, 20 more minutes before I have to pack up my bass and get to the hall for work. And in the evening too, I'm I'm playing maybe 20 minutes at a time, maybe 35 minutes at a time, but then I'm taking breaks. You know, some of my breaks are 10 minutes, some of them are 30 minutes, just kind of whatever I feel I need to not get worn out in the hands and the fingers. And I try to get as much sleep as possible. You know, I know like LeBron James sleeps 9 hours a night, and that's why he's so good. I don't always have time for that. I do make sure to get that much sleep in like the couple days before an audition, but for the month or two leading up to it, I'm definitely like a little sleep deprived and exhausted and not having a lot of fun the whole time. But I know it's going to be worth it at the end, because even if I don't win the job, I mean, I obviously want every job that I audition for, but if I don't win the job, I can still look back on the process and tell myself, hey, you worked as hard as you could, you know, good job. You are better now for that. Because I've done the opposite, where I've showed up to an audition, and this is kind of what prompted me to start preparing this way, is after basically every audition that I didn't win, which was the first, 20 of them or something, 24 of them, I would look back on the process and I would say, oh, I could have worked harder. You know, there was that one day I took off, or those couple days that I took off, or that day that I only practiced an hour, or that day that I hung it up at 5 p.m. when I really could have stayed till 7 or 8 p.m. And so it's really nice to just look back and say, nope, I did everything that I set out to do. I worked as hard as possible. And now I can like relax for at least a couple weeks.
I've always been a sort of, I wouldn't call it practice journaling, but tracking my practicing. And I found that really helpful, particularly when I was taking auditions or preparing for something like that. Do you still, when you're preparing for an audition, do you still keep track of things in written form?
Only in the, the pages that you said you've excerpted on the in my previous interview. Only like that. I don't take like detailed written notes, with words. It's just a number, which excerpt, what tempo I'm playing it at, what drone I'm using, how many times I played it, and what part of the beat or what part of the bar the click is on. And I just keep track of that just so I can see the progression, and mostly just so I can not skip anything on accident. Sure, we've also all had that experience where you're preparing a ton of music and you're like, all right, I'm super ready. And then you get to the audition or the gig or whatever, and you go, oh crap, I forgot one. Oh no. And then your sight reading's no fun.
Are the metronome and drone on throughout this part of the phase that we're talking about?
100%.
Okay.
Every single time. I might do a couple reps of very specific excerpts without a drone if they're just really if they're super modulatory or really chromatic or something where drones kind of make it more uncomfortable. I might do a couple without a drone, but even then I still want to just be relating to a fixed pitch. I find a pitch, maybe one of the pitches that my open strings are tuned to. I don't tune exactly equal with all 4 open strings, but whichever one is equal, which will usually be the D or the A, I'll put the drone on that just so that I'm relating to something that is absolute and fixed. But yeah, metronome, drone for, whether it's 10 days or 3 months, every single note that I play towards the audition is metronome and drone.
And I recall in either our previous conversation with Ryan, you don't always necessarily take everything to 100%. You get close. Is that how? Because I think people listening, it starts at 50, got to be exactly 100. Then we're ready for mock auditions. How does that work for you?
I actually still just go to 90.
Okay.
I don't actually go past 90 with the metronome. Sometimes I find out that my goal tempo was a little faster or slower than I wanted it to be. When I get to 90 and I'm playing, I think, oh, this is pretty quick. Then I'll look at it and go, oh, whoops. Like when I tapped it out to start the process, or I played it once and tapped the metronome to start the process, I was a little off. So it's, it's not an exact science. But yeah, I go to 90 and I just kind of I wouldn't say nerves take care of the rest, because I take beta blockers for every single audition. But I let the kind of live performance element take care of that last few percent. It really goes back to what Andy said about muscles remember feeling, not speed. You know, if I can play it really, really well and feel super comfortable at 90% tempo, I'm not going to worry about that last 10% jump in tempo. And also playing a tempo in an audition, you know, 100% versus 94% versus 105%, that's such a small difference that it's going to be almost the same. And I would like to play generally a little slower in auditions than I would than the music actually goes, just so that it's easier for me and I can demonstrate more security and command of the instrument, and also so it's easier for the committee to listen to. You know, they can actually hear all the notes, especially the non-bass players who these low frequencies are like a bunch of grumbly, you know, furniture moving stuff. If you just play a little slower, they can actually hear the notes. And you know, if I'm the only player at an audition where they heard every note, like that's the ultimate badge of success for me.
It's something I think people, especially when you spend a lot of time hanging around other bass players who are also taking auditions, it's easy to forget, especially while you're still in school and you've never listened to auditions. Like, most of those people are not playing your instrument, or a good percentage of the people listening to that audition are flute player, violin player. And I know when I've listened to like a violin audition or a flute audition or percussion audition, it's like, you know, all of a sudden you're like, you know, you're not in your wheelhouse anymore, and that's a really great takeaway for people to take. I also love, because I know you talked about it publicly, but like I rarely ask people about beta blockers just because some people may or may not want to talk about it. I never took them, and probably should have when I was taking auditions, but I did play, this is like 15 years ago maybe, I got a chance to play a recital on Gary Carr's old bass, the Amati Carr-Kusevitsky, and I was getting ready, and I looked out, and it's like, there's the Chicago Symphony bass section and the Lyric Opera bass section. Not for me, but to hear the bass. And I had a buddy who was there, and he's like, hey, I always have beta blockers. Are you what? And I'm like, yes, please. And I'll tell you, that took you could still find the video. It's very grainy, 2 megapixel camera footage. That took the edge off, and I don't think I'd taken an audition since then. But like, how do you approach beta blockers, like just like tactically? Like, are you taking? Sorry, I have too many questions. But like, when you get to the mock audition phase, are you taking them before you do mock auditions for people? Or is it strictly an audition day thing?
Just the audition day for me.
Okay.
If for people who haven't taken them before, I mean, test them out before. You know, take them for a mock, take them for a
don't do what I did.
Studio class or something. But I mean, the thing is, I don't really see much of a harm in even trying it at the audition. I would rather be a little too tired than a little too nervous.
Yeah.
And that's the only risk with beta blockers, is if you take a dosage that's a little higher than what you should be taking, you might feel a little foggy or fuzzy or kind of zonked out. On audition days, I'm drinking a ton of caffeine and I start with, you know, my regular dose. It was 10, now it's 20, but then like 6 hours later, I'll take another. 4 or 5 hours later, I'll take another. So at the end of the day, I'm like 3 beta blockers and 7 espressos deep. But leading up to the audition, mock auditions, I actually want to feel a little nervous. I basically want to manufacture the positive feedback response in the audition that comes from hearing yourself sound better than you've ever heard yourself. So like in mock auditions, I'm sleep deprived, I'm not warmed up, I'm warmed up a little. I don't really do the cold mock thing, but it's like when you're trying to schedule mocks, especially once you got a job, you know, you look and you go, okay, well, I can get this big room from this time to this time, but I have a rehearsal then, and I've got 3 friends coming, but they can only be there for this hour. So I'm like running around town for a week, just trying to squeeze as many mock auditions as possible as I can into that time. And I'm like, I'm not showing up and presenting my absolute best self because I just don't have time to like get super centered and calm and comfy. I'm not taking beta blockers for those mocks, and I'm definitely sleep deprived that last week. But then the day of the audition, I've had like 2 nights of excellent sleep. I only played an hour of bass the day before and, 30 minutes or 40 minutes in the warm-up room before the audition. So I'm like rocking, everything is so fresh. I feel so good. And I've taken a beta blocker, so I'm not even nervous. And it just feels like an out-of-body experience. Like, I didn't know I was so good. It's amazing. It makes the audition itself more fun.
Well, I love that you're drinking coffee too the day. I remember that the advice I got that I took, and it's like traumatized me. I still can't eat a banana because the moment I eat a banana, I feel like I'm taking an audition. Like it's been so many years, and then like I always heard like you don't want to drink too much coffee, so I wouldn't drink coffee, and then I'd have this like caffeine withdrawal headache, and I'd be angry and just for no reason. And so I love the combination of allowing yourself the caffeine.
Yeah. Well, it's with if I didn't take beta blockers, I would probably try to do the wean off caffeine thing that a lot of people do. But yeah, you find that nice combination of uppers and downers. It puts you right in the center in that relaxed focus zone.
Well, and you mentioned something backstage last week. I don't know if you've talked about it publicly for the podcast, but I thought it was a really interesting sentiment. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't take beta blockers when there's like a solo in the orchestra or for something like that. But I recall you saying something like an audition is one of the only times when you are playing bass with millions of dollars. If we zoom out at stake,
you are competing for millions of dollars, and there's just no way around that. If you win the job, you're going to get paid whatever, a 6-figure salary for the next 30 years. That's $3 million at least. So no other time are you playing music with that much at stake. Yeah. Maybe a solo competition that leads to a solo career in a recital series or something. But even then, there's no guarantee. You're just it's like an interview. With an audition, you are actually competing for millions of dollars. And so the stakes are just so much higher than anything else. When I give a recital, or I play in a master class, or I take a lesson with someone who makes me nervous, or play a mock audition for my friends, or play a solo in the orchestra, anything, I'm not taking beta blockers. I did break that rule, which isn't, it's not really a rule, it's just kind of the way that I used to operate. I did take beta blockers recently after getting the assistant position. We did kind of an opera review concert, and there was like a Baroque bass solo. And I played the first rehearsal and started playing and felt good. And then about halfway through the page, I felt myself get really nervous. I didn't like crash and burn or anything. I got through it and I sounded, I liked how I sounded, but I didn't like how I felt. It felt really uncomfortable. The kind of chest, tight chest and tight breath, and kind of felt hot, and like my mind was sort of buzzing, not fun. And then the dress rehearsal, same thing. I thought, okay, I'll like work on my breathing a little more. And then of course, as soon as the other basses drop out after the first 4 bars and I'm playing alone, I'm like, oh, there it is again. Yeah, I don't like that. No fun. So I took a beta blocker for the concert, and it's fine. I have tons of colleagues in St. Louis, and I'm sure in every other orchestra around the country, there's a large handful of people who take beta blockers for every performance. One of the finest musicians in the St. Louis Symphony that I know takes beta blockers every day, takes them for every rehearsal. You're getting paid to sound a certain way, and if there's a simple tool that you can use to stay at that level, fine.
Well, and particularly when we're thinking about these instruments that you're basically a soloist at all times, or like in harmony with a duet. We bass players often are a little less in the spotlight, so it's an understandable thing, and it's great to. I think it's great for people to hear how a professional manages this, because I think probably it's changing, but there is a kind of like being injured in some ways. There's certain subjects that are like traditionally not touched so much in when people are talking about music and preparation.
Yeah, kind of either used to be, or maybe kind of still is for some people, taboo, or there's a stigma around it or something. I don't think there really is any stigma anymore. I know Some teachers are very anti-beta blocker. They will actively tell their students, you should never take these. But then there are other ones who, I've had friends who like go from that teacher to this other one, who they go to an audition, they come back, and the teacher says, how did it go? Oh, well, I got nervous. And they're like, well, did you take your beta blockers at the right time? They're like, what? My what? They're like, why aren't you taking beta blockers? What's wrong with you? So, it's kind of a balance between realism and idealism, and whatever is comfortable for whoever's listening, like, do that. But there's really no stigma around it. I learned about it from my mom, who's a doctor, and she said all the doctors take them for their oral boards. At the very end of med school, you have to sit down and be interviewed by a bunch of other doctors who are going to decide whether you're going to be a doctor, and you have to recall 8 years of information under pressure and just spit it back out. And so they were all taking beta blockers for that. So I found out about them back in high school from her, and it was like I told her about my college auditions and how uncomfortable I felt, and I was really nervous, and I was prepared, but then I played so much worse than I prepared, and classic symptoms of. And she was listening as a doctor, going, "Yeah, what you're describing is textbook performance anxiety. Here, try this." And now. Yeah, if you talk to most auditioning bassists or most auditioning musicians around the country, beta blockers are totally ubiquitous. There are a few people who don't need them and don't use them, and that's great for them, but the vast majority do.
Yeah, and I think that's something just to consider if you're in this process and you find yourself getting catastrophic anxiety during the audition, which I certainly am familiar with.
I think we all are.
And if you just know that this is a tool that is being used so prevalently, just food for thought. Mm-hmm. I have another question about so you have this I think beautiful solitary time. You're starting at 50% tempo, and then you're moving it up, and then you're describing the less controlled phase of playing mock auditions and squeezing in time. How do you, when you're in that mock audition phase, pre-audition, how do you take in feedback? How do you record the playing and listen to the feedback? Do you just play and kind of reflect on what they say? Do you how does the feedback of others in that mock audition phase kind of factor into your final prep?
Well, I record every single mock audition. Mm-hmm. And actually my first 1 or 2 mock auditions are for myself. Mm-hmm. I just run the list down with a recorder. And then I either immediately listen, or preferably I wait a few hours or even overnight to kind of forget what my perception of the performance was. So I'm listening with fresh ears. And then I listen to the recording and I just take notes on everything I didn't like about it. Mm-hmm. This tempo's too fast, or this tempo's too slow, or you need more clarity here, or this phrase, this sounds like an accent rather than leading to that note. Whatever my observation is, I'll just write it down. And sometimes even just writing it down is enough to make it happen. But then what my plan is so in this whole week of mock auditions, or 10 days, however long it takes, day 1 is I wake up and I record the list. And then, have lunch, and then I'll listen to that recording and take notes. And then I will sit down for a practice session, and I only practice the notes. So I don't, if my note for one excerpt is missed the shift from B flat to E flat or something, I don't play the excerpt. I just practice that shift, 3 or 4 times, comfortable, calm, and I don't test it out. I don't see if it worked. I'm done with that. Okay, then I move to the next bullet point, the next excerpt, and the problem that I had with that one. And it's super, super targeted, focused practice on what I'm actually hearing. And then as far as taking in other people's, to actually answer your question, taking in other people's feedback, I record all those mocks and I listen to what they say, and I will, you kind of have to just filter. You take everything with a grain of salt. If you play for 10 people and all 10 of them say the same thing, you should probably do that. If you play for 10 people and one person says something that nobody else says, if you identify with it, if it resonates with you and you feel like, hey, that's a really cool, piece of information, I'm going to use that, then use it. But if it's something that you don't really agree with and they're the only one who said it, you can probably just say, well, that's for them. I'll do my own thing. Because ultimately you have to feel comfortable with what you're presenting, and confident in the approach that you are giving to the committee.
With that slow half-tempo approach, I mean, you're literally turning every page of every note, but then you're going in and actually just like tactically, like what needs work, rather than like wasting all your time and life essence like on things that don't need work. And so to me, it's just this lovely balance of just like absolute research, scientific work, and then just the facts at the end as you get into it. And another thing that I thought was super cool listening to you talk in the past is the actual day of. So correct me if I'm wrong, but generally there's not like an extensive warm-up that you're doing as you're in this prep. You're just kind of like getting the bass out, put on the rosin, you're in tune, and off to the races, right?
Yeah, exactly. But then the day of the audition, I actually do get a calm, comfortable, slow warm-up. I'm in a new, your bass goes into a new building, and so I'm tuning it obsessively. Like every 10 minutes, I give it another run through with the tuner to make sure nothing's slipped at all. I spend some time doing like very gentle, I wouldn't even call them hand position exercises because that sounds tiring. Even just the word hand position exercise or the phrase hand position exercises sounds tiring. But I'm just kind of doing like a very gentle warm up to just feel like I know where my left hand is, I know where my right hand is, I know where my feet are, I know where my head is at. Just kind of get everything locked in and in the pocket. I am not running anything at tempo or at volume before I'm on stage. I'm playing things through slowly and under tempo just so I can save all my strength. And again, back to that, like, muscles remember feeling, not speed. The last thing that I want to remember is how easy the excerpts can feel, because I've already played it a dozen times, or in my lifetime, like thousands of times at tempo. And so going out on stage, like, I'm not going to forget how to do that. What I'm at risk of forgetting how to do is play it in a really calm, collected, poised manner with like total physical coordination. And so that's the last thing that I want my muscles to remember. And yeah, like like you said, in the mock audition phase, and even in all the percentage build-up phase of my prep, yeah, I don't have time to do a 20-minute warm-up to make sure I'm like ready to go. I'm basically just, I put on rosin, I get my rosin worked into all 4 strings across, all my contact points. I tune the bass, and then I turn on I look at my notebook and see what my next percentage is, and I turn the metronome on, and I turn the drone on, and I go.
I imagine that people kind of embarking on their audition journey are probably listening to this or watching this. A couple more nuts and bolts things, like an audition's on a Monday. How early, and life's not always ideal, but how early would you want to get to the city in which you're auditioning, and like any just advice for handling? Like, I remember having a fun but painful conversation with Joe McFadden in Atlanta about auditions, and he had one where his end pin slipped out of the Uber, and he showed up to the audition, had no end pin, and everybody at the audition had like an unconventional end pin. They had like a wooden angle end pin, or they had something, and so he was like practicing with his end pin socket in his shoe, not optimal, and then finally he said somebody at the last second showed up with a 10mm pin, but he was so off his game, he just ate it. So, you can't control everything, of course, and you learn lessons the hard way, but like, just like tactical, like how would you recommend someone approach acclimating themselves to the foreign city hall, all that kind of jazz?
Well, I mean, give it as much time as you can within your time constraints and your budget constraints. Ideally, like, you'd get to the city 4 days early, and so if there's any mix-up with the baggage in the airline, or a car flat tire or whatever, all that stuff's taken care of. The instrument's damaged, you have time to like go get it fixed and get an adjustment or something. That's not very realistic. Most people are coming from like a gig or coming from class at school, or they don't have the money to, like 4 nights in a hotel before the audition. It's a little much. I usually fly in or drive in the day before. I try to avoid getting in like at night before the audition, but sometimes it's just that's what has to be done. For my Minnesota audition, I remember we had a matinee performance in Seattle, and then I drove straight to the airport and flew to Minnesota and got there at midnight or something, and then had an audition at 9 a.m. So sometimes you just have to roll the dice and be a little uncomfortable, but if possible, like, take your time getting there, make sure you're well rested, give yourself enough time to account for emergencies. And then I always, as much as possible, I always buy a hotel room right across from the hall, like across the street, just so that there's no added stress in the morning getting to the audition. I drive a lot, so driving isn't an inherently stressful activity for me, but there is like some cortisol that gets released into your bloodstream when you're driving. I mean, you're going through traffic, you hit more red lights than you want. Some lanes are closed. There's construction. So many things that can obviously the worst, like an accident or something. There's so many things that could happen on the way to the hall. So if I just spend a little bit more money and get myself within walking distance of the hall, that helps me feel a lot better on the day. And then usually like the night before or maybe the morning of, but usually the night before, I'll just like walk the route. Like while I'm out getting dinner, I'll make sure that I walk from the hotel to the hall just so I know exactly how much time it's going to take. I know where the stage door is, and I'm not like frantically circling the building with my bass and my stool, late for my check-in time or something. I try to get a nice meal the day before just to feel very calm and at peace. I like to get like a nice sushi meal if I can. But you have to find what works for you, what makes you feel comfortable. But basically just try to eliminate any extraneous variables, and anything that could go wrong, will go wrong. So like give yourself time to manage those disasters. And then as far as getting to the hall, I take a beta blocker and out. Oh, that's one thing about beta blockers too. People always ask, like, when do you take them? I take them an hour before I leave, an hour before I get to the hall. I don't want to feel, they take about an hour to like fully take effect, and I don't want to be nervous when I'm checking in. I don't want to get into the group warm-up room and hear everybody else playing and get nervous and practice in a way that isn't what I'm planning on. I don't want to panic practice. I don't want to get nervous and train myself to like feel added pressure or stress or panic while playing. So I make sure I'm like fully zoned up by the time I get to the hall. And then 6 hours later or something, as the beta blocker's wearing off, I'll take another if the audition's still going.
Yeah, rolling with the punches the day of the audition is always an interesting, because like you said, what can go wrong often will go wrong, and maybe things are running late or they're running early. Like how what's your just approach to like time on the bass, or like all of a sudden things are taking a lot longer than you were expecting, or you're going to play like just. And I don't know, this is not a very good question, apologies, but it's like what have you learned about just rolling with the punches, like when it's actual audition?
Yeah, don't overplay. That's like the best thing you can do is not, like, you've already practiced this stuff, or I've already practiced this stuff enough times. I've played enough, a little under warmed up. I do not want to be tired. You might have to play another round. They might ask you to play again. They might ask you to do a couple excerpts over again. You might have to do that twice. Like, you might play what you're thinking is going to be a single round prelim day. You might play 4 rounds worth of excerpts, and I don't want the very last round of that to be like tired and flabby. I want to still feel strong and hot. And so yeah, I when I get in the warm-up room and I get the list, I don't run it. I'll maybe practice the starts a little bit. I'll practice starting each excerpt, ending the excerpt, and then turning the page and starting the next one, working on that transition. If there's anything that makes me a little nervous, maybe something really fast and chopsy, I'll play it slow. If like Mozart 35, last movement is on the list, I'll just play like just really calm, slow, comfortable, let my body just sink into the bass and feel like nothing can go wrong, because as we said, if something can go wrong, it will. And then, if they're running late, like, I try to just take breaks. I have a book with me in the warm-up room, and so I don't just play until they call me out. I'll play for enough, as long as it takes to get my rosin on all the strings, the bass in tune, and get my body in tune, kind of have my hands feel how I want them to feel. And when I get to that point, I stop playing. I'll sit down, read my book a little, look at my phone maybe, although I try to avoid that in the audition room, in the warm-up room itself. And then, if they're taking a lot, I'll take maybe 10 minutes off. I don't want to get cold, so then I'll pick up the bass again and play a little more, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, tune, just double check the tuning, tune it again, and just do that in kind of bursts, So I'm playing for, it's like 3 minutes on, 7 minutes off, or something like that, until they call me out, or until they come give me a 10-minute warning. And then I might play for 7-8 minutes straight, just to really feel warmed up.
You're making me remember my bass teacher at Northwestern, Michael Hovnanian. I remember him sharing I think his first professional audition was the Phoenix Symphony, and there was some guy in the collective warm-up room who was he was like, and it was like a concrete room, and the guy was just playing a bass, Helton Levin number 9 over and over, and like missing the shift and going like, no, and it's like the least calming thing to have. So your approach, I think, probably a little more grounded.
Yeah, and I'll play, I mean, if I don't know what the list is, some auditions like Chicago or Cleveland, you don't get the list until you're on stage. So I'll just sort of, maybe if there's anything really difficult or that makes me nervous, I'll play it just slow and under tempo, under volume. If there's anything that I feel really confident about and I really like the way I sound on it, maybe I'll play a little excerpt of that, something like the Haydn 31 solo. Maybe I won't like run the thing from front to back, but I might play, the first few bars of it. I might play like one of my favorite ornaments in the second half, something that I do in the repeat. Just things to kind of build my confidence and feel good about playing the bass.
Well, I love it. Brendan, you rock. I definitely have one last question. If we're in St. Louis and we're looking for barbecue, besides your place, if you're cooking, best barbecue recommendation? You got a solid one? Or
Definitely.
Okay.
Pappy's.
Okay.
Pappy's for the ribs and the burn ends. Everything there is great, but the ribs are the best I've ever had. Offense to Kansas City. Yeah, sorry. And there's another place, actually, it's not barbecue, but Max Local Eats is probably the best burger I've ever had. The guy who owns it, Chris McKenzie, is always there, like walking around, talking to customers, talking about St. Louis, and the food is just killer. My old teacher was in town for a baseball tournament with his kid recently, and I gave him recommendations. He went to Pappy's. He said that was a big hit. And then he went to Max, and he said, "You're 2 for 2. I'm like, yes. So.
And I wasn't hungry until I brought up food, and now I'm all of a sudden hungry for lunch.
Yeah, let's get some lunch.